Good morning. Agudvoch, Shavuot Tov. Just to mention that the learning today is dedicated for a Shlema for Ita Yehudis Bas Esther Chana and Ovadia ben Sarah Imenu. He's God together with all those who need a refuah shalema. It's very interesting just to feel how different the world is from the last time we did this to how it is now, and especially as we're just hours away from Tisha B'Av. I think the tension is rising in all of our minds and collectively. So please God, we should see great miracles. I know we all expect the worst, God forbid, on Tisha B'Av, but there is room also to expect the best. We know the Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av, so Hashem can do great things. What we're going to do today is have a look at the problem. Because I'm going to ask a question and you're going to think that this is a strange question to ask. But honestly, can we be honest for just a moment? What's so bad about lashon hara? There are other things going on in our Jewish community, if we're honest. And there's some very serious things happening in the Jewish community, as there have been for centuries. What's so bad about lashon hara? It spreads like a wildfire, yes? Lashon hara spreads like a wildfire. What do they say about lashon hara? About gossip and about... remember, lashon hara is the truth. It's usually when something isn't true. That's when it spins around the world. They say in today's world that it is possible for lashon hara to get all the way around the world before you've even read the message on your phone. So it spreads, absolutely. It spreads like wildfire. Is that what's so bad about it? That tells us it's contagious. That tells us it's virus-like. But let's be honest. You remember there was this period of COVID-19? Does anybody remember that? Does anybody know that this year, and I don't want to mention the name of the event because it is associated with Avodah Zarah, but there's an athletic event happening in the world at the moment. And there was somebody who won their race with COVID. It's not a question of how contagious it is or how virally it spreads. The question is how bad the disease is. What's so bad about lashon hara?
Negativity.
Negative. It's negative, right? Lashon hara is negative. So let's have a look at a story. It destroys people. Destroys people. Hatred, unfortunately, also destroys people. And we're going to see the link between them. Let's start off with a story. One of the earliest stories of lashon hara that we ever encounter. And you know the story. Everybody knows the story. That's the best part about this. It's the stories that we know that are the stories that we don't know. It's because we think that we know those stories. That's why we don't often look further into those stories. I know that story already. In fact, by way of introduction, in Pirkei Avos, in the 5th chapter, for those people who come on Monday mornings, this is a paid advert for the Monday morning Pirkei Avos Shir, which happens just down the passageway over here. So you'll know that in the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avos, it's the chapter of Numbers, which is interesting because it corresponds to the 5th chapter the 5th chapter where Moshe Rabbeinu goes back in Torah, and he recounts all the things which started with Numbers, the numbers of days that it took, even though we don't call the 5th book of the Torah Numbers. So the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avos, one of the numbers that it speaks about is 7 indicators of a goylem and 7 indicators of a chacham. What's a goylem? What's a goylem? A goylem is to be, we can't speak lashon hara today, is somebody who's not so smart. And a chacham is somebody who is very smart. So the Mishnah lists the 7 indicators of a goylem, and then it says the 7 of a chacham, of a wise person, says v'chilufei and begoylem. The opposite is a goylem. One of the indicators of a chacham, says the Mishnah, alma sheloi shama oimer loi shamati. If he has not heard something, he says, I have not heard it. In other words, if he hasn't learned something, he admits that he hasn't learned it. That's wisdom. Wisdom is the ability to admit what we don't know. So what's the opposite? Because the goylem is the opposite. No cheating from the people in the Pirkei Avos Shir. Leave it for everybody else. So what is the opposite of a chacham? If a chacham is somebody who what they haven't heard, they say they haven't heard it, what's the opposite of a goylem? So let's put it into the words. The words are that the chacham, what he hasn't heard, he says he hasn't heard. So what does the goylem say? He has heard. Then he's not a goylem, he's a liar. If he hasn't heard something and he claims that he has heard it, then he's a liar. So what's a goylem? The opposite of a chacham. Again, the chacham ma sheloi shama oimer loi shamaiti. The chacham, if he hasn't heard something, says I haven't heard it. The goylem opposite is al ma sheshama oimer shamati. On what he has heard, he says I have heard it. So what's so foolish about that? The key is the word ma. Ma. A wise person, al ma sheloi shama. If there's just one little detail that he hasn't heard clearly, oimer loi shamati. He says, I don't know anything about the subject. I have to learn everything from the start. That's wisdom. The wisdom to know that if there's something missing in the story, I don't know the story. What's a goylem? Ma sheshama. It sounds vaguely familiar. Ah, shamaiti. I've already heard that one. And then you don't learn anything. So it's those stories in the Torah that we know, which are dafka the stories that we often don't know. Here's the story. Moshe Rabbeinu, as we well know, had a very interesting start to life. He did not go to a good Jewish day school. He did not grow up in a house where they made Kiddush and sang Zmiros every Friday night. He grew up, where? Where did he grow up? In Paro's palace. In Pharaoh's palace. Can you imagine what that is? Can you imagine what that is? That is to grow up in the most antithetical spiritual environment. And then one day, Moshe decides he's got to see what's going on outside of the palace. What's happening with the Jewish community? How are the Jews faring in the reality of Egypt? Because he's in a protected environment. So he goes up and he checks what's happening with his brothers. And what does he find? Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'echov. He finds an Egyptian taskmaster mercilessly beating a Jewish slave. What does Moshe do? He gets rid of the problem, as we say. He eliminates the terrorist. The next day, here's the part of the story we're going to focus on. The next day, Moshe Rabbeinu goes out again, and what does he see? Shnei Ivrim Nitzim, two Jews having a go at each other. And he says to the wicked one, why are you hitting your colleague? What does the guy respond to him? Don't get involved. Me, samcha leish, sar v'shofet aleinu, who appointed you as a minister or a prince and a judge over us? Halohorageni ato oimer ka'asher horakto es hamitzri. Are you going to kill me verbally as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? The next few words are the key to what we're going to explore today. What does Moshe say? Achein noida hadavar. Achein is one of those biblical words that doesn't really have a modern English translation. How do you say achen? How do you say? Behold. Yeah, because we always say behold. At the beginning of our WhatsApps, we say behold. The WhatsApp I'm about to forward to you. Achein. It's this moment of realization. Noida hadavar. How do you translate that? Noida, the thing, hadavar, noida, it's in the passive voice. Noida, it was known, it's become known. What's he saying?
Oh, you're in trouble.
Makava is blown. That's what Moshe is effectively saying. Yesterday he killed an Egyptian, and he thought nobody saw, and nobody was going to report back to Paroi. Ochein oi gewalt noida hadavar. It's now out in the public domain, and the word's going to get back to Paroi, and I'm in trouble. That's the meaning. Did I say anything that's inaccurate? That's the meaning. That's the story as we know it. Until, of course, you read what Rashi has to say, which is based on the Medrash Tanchuma. Rashi says that Moshe was wondering if the Jews deserve to leave Egypt. And then he discovered Noida Hadavar, and now appreciate why they haven't yet left Egypt. Why? Because they speak lashon hara. Because these guys, who happen, by the way, to be Dasan and Aviram, the thorn in the side of Moshe right throughout the early part of his career, they are willing to report to Paroi what just happened. So now Moshe says, I understand why they haven't been allowed Geula. I understand why they haven't broken out of Mitzrayim after all of these years. Why? Because they're willing to speak lashon hara about each other. Now you understand how bad lashon hara is. It could prevent, God forbid, Geula. It could prevent, God forbid, Mashiach coming. That was their time of Mashiach. We're in our time of Mashiach. Then Moshe Rabbeinu, who, by the way, was the Mashiach of the time, said clearly the reason that they haven't deserved Geula is because they speak lashon hara. That's how serious it is. Now, you might be wondering, hang on a second, as I said in the beginning, but there are other problems in the Jewish community. I mean, I don't want to speak lashon hara about the Jewish community, but there are other problems in the Jewish community. Much more problems, right? In fact, let's not talk about us, because we don't, God forbid, want to say anything negative about our own community. Let's talk about the Jews in Egypt, because the Torah tells us about them. And if the Torah tells us about them, then it's okay. It's public knowledge. It's endorsed by God himself. We could speak about it. How were the Jews? Let's put it this way. I love this word, by the way. It's the most misleading word in the whole of Judaism. Frum. What does frum mean? I'll tell you exactly what frum means. Frum is exactly the same as driving on the M1 highway. Anybody in front of you is too slow, and anybody driving behind you is a meshugana. That's frum. Anybody who's ahead of me is a meshugana. Anybody who's behind me is a heretic. So how frum were the Jews in Egypt? It's an interesting question, because how could you be frum before the Torah was given? Okay, in the context of the information they had at the time, would have been passed down from Noach and then Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. How frum were the Jews in Egypt? In some ways very frum. In which ways were they very frum? Right, there was. That's true. That's true. The Gemara makes a big deal about the modesty that the women had. The Gemara in Sota talks about how incredible the women were in terms of their modesty and the perpetuation of the Jewish people under fire, which is a huge achievement. What else did they do? They kept their identity, right? That's what we know. They kept their identity. They didn't change their clothing. They didn't change their language. They didn't change their names. Okay, and outside of that, how frum were they? Thank you, exactly. Do you remember what happens at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf? So the Malachim come complaining to Hashem. Why is it that you're drowning the Egyptian army, but you're saving the Jewish people? Eilu oivdei avodah zara, ve'eilu oivdei avodah zara. The Egyptians serve idols, and the Bnei Yisrael also serve idols. Now, I don't know what your standard is for frum, but where I come from, serving idols is not frum. Is that fair? It's a fair comment? So Moshe Rabbeinu goes out to check on the people who, quite frankly, he knew something about. I'm sure he was no fool. I'm sure he had means of getting, some kind of feedback of what was going on. They're all engaged in avodah zarah, and he's like, that's fine. That's not a problem. But they speak lashon hara. Now they can't leave Mitzrayim. Does that make sense? We're willing to accommodate idolatry, but we're not willing to accommodate the possibility that they speak badly about each other? How? How's that even possible? Now, I know what you're going to say. Because this is obviously a very learned group, so you're all going to say, but we know what the Gemara says. The Gemara in Erchin says a person who speaks lashon hara is kekoifer beikar. It's the equivalent of complete denial of God. So there you go. It's the equivalent. lashon hara, avodah zarah are on the same playing field. Yes? Yes? Everybody's nervous to say anything now. Speaking about such high stakes. If you get this wrong, there might be a lightning bolt. So, okay, there's another Gemara also right there in Erchin that says that speaking lashon hara equates to the three cardinal sins: avodah zarah, gilei aroyos, shvichas damim, idolatry, adultery, and murder. So you get it now, right? This is why lashon hara is so bad. Are we all happy? So if you have a choice between lashon hara and avodah zarah, it's the same. May as well serve avodah zarah. Is that what we're saying? No, we're not saying that. It does not say the same. It says ke'ilu. It's not the same. It's like, it's similar to. Which means it still doesn't really make sense to us why it is that Moshe Rabbeinu was okay with them serving idolatry, but he was not okay with them speaking lashon hara. How could it be that lashon hara is even worse? That's not what the Gemara says. Worse than avodah zarah? It doesn't say that in the Gemara. We might want to say that when we're trying to, get people to keep their mouth shut, but it's not what the Gemara says. So what actually is the big problem with lashon hara? Why is it so devastating? Besides the fact, of course, you know what the rule is of lashon hara? Are you familiar? There's a rule, the golden rule of lashon hara. If somebody is willing to tell you lashon hara, they're willing to tell lashon hara about you. That's the problem. The problem is we're all at risk. That's why sometimes people try to be that person who has all the freshest gossip, because maybe that way they can protect themselves about being the victim of gossip. So is that the problem? Is the problem that it affects us personally? That it might hurt us? Is that what we're so worried about? There's something we're missing in the story. Now there's another medrash. I quoted to you before the medrash Tanchuma, which Rashi quotes, but Rashi himself later on then quotes the medrash Rabbah. And the Medrash Rabbah says the story a little differently. It's the same story. Moshe goes outside and he checks what's happening with the Jewish people and he kills the Egyptian, and then the next day he sees the two Jews fighting, and then the one Jew says, "Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" And then he says, "Achei noidah hadavar." But this time, the Medrash says the whole story a little differently. It says Moshe was wondering for his whole life, what did the Jewish nation do more than all the other nations to deserve this horrible slavery? That's a different question, right? It's a different question. The first version of the Medrash was, why have they not yet been taken out of Egypt? What's blocking their exit is lashon hara. But the Medrash Rabbah is speaking differently, saying, why did they get into this mess in the first place? What is the reason they deserve this kind of punishment? And Moshe specifically says, more than the other nations of the world. And his answer is, lashon hara.
Wasn't it because Yosef spoke?
That's not this Medrash. Right? That it was what? It was because they have lashon hara, because they speak lashon hara. It's interesting, the Medrash over the years uses an unusual expression for lashon hara. It uses the word daltoirin. And there's another place that we use that word as well. It's in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in the tractate Peah, right at the beginning of the Gemara. And you know this because you've heard this before. The Gemara there says, how is it that David HaMelech, King David, in spite of the fact that his army included some of the greatest scholars in Jewish history, but they sometimes lost the wars. Whereas Achav, who wasn't the frummest of all the kings in our history, and was an idolater, yet his army won all of their wars. Says the Gemara, why? Because in the time of King David, there were Jews who were willing to speak negatively about each other, whereas in the time of Achav, they did not speak negatively about each other. And there it uses the same word, daltoria, the same word that the Medrash over here uses, which is this slandering of people within the community. So maybe that's the answer, because the Gemara is telling us that when you have lashon hara, then you're vulnerable, you're exposed, God forbid the enemies could harm us, and when there's no lashon hara, we're protected and nobody could touch us. Maybe that's the message. Why is it that the Jewish people deserve to have such difficulty? Because we spoke lashon hara as Moshe experienced firsthand, and therefore we're vulnerable. Somehow lashon hara exposes us. Whereas if we don't speak lashon hara, we're protected. And of course, when we're protected, nobody can harm us. And then, of course, we could firstly escape the galus, and secondly, never be slaves in the first place. I have to ask a question that I think is a really important question. It's not politically correct. Are Jews the only nation on earth who gossip?
No.
Of course not. The whole tabloid world is not unique to the Jews. Yes, we don't want to speak lashon hara, but there are some Jewish publications who try to emulate the tabloids of the world. But gossip is not unique to the Jewish people.
But we are unique.
We're unique, but gossip is not unique. Moshe's question is, how come out of all of the nations on earth, the Jewish people are the ones who deserve such brutality? And he answers, because we speak lashon hara, and the other nations get away with it. The other nations, if they speak badly about each other, they are okay. That's acceptable. Why? That sounds like a double standard. Sounds a little bit unfair. Sounds a little bit, I think it was Groucho Marx who said, God, why can't you choose somebody else for a change? Sounds totally unfair. Why us? Why the Jews, as they say? Am Segula, right? We're Am Segula. I'm sorry, but when we signed up to be Hashem's chosen nation, I don't believe we signed up for harsh treatment. We signed up, he's going to be our father, he's going to take us to the promised land. Because we're the chosen people, we should get wrapped up in the knuckles so badly. If lashon hara is something which is fundamentally wrong, or to translate it into the language of the nations, if gossip is something which is so destructive, why is it only so destructive for us? Why is it not so bad in the rest of the world? What is it about the Jews? And I'll ask you just one other question while we're about it. The lashon hara that Dasan and Aviram were about to tell about Moshe, how does it rate on the scale of lashon hara? Because I'm sure we all in our minds have some subjective scale of lashon hara. You know, there's lashon hara that's really bad, and then there's lashon hara that's not so bad, and then there's lashon hara that's letoeles, so it's actually good. So where do you think it is on the range of lashon hara spectrum? Where do you think the lashon hara of Dasan and Aviram fits? You know, it's like the Nando's bottles. Is it mild? Is it strong? Is it really strong? Why is it so bad?
Because they could get into serious.
Correct. Because this is not just lashon hara in the classical sense of, hey, did you hear? This is what we call moiser, masira. They're about to hand Moshe over to the king, reporting him for killing one of the officers. This is a capital offense. How come Moshe does not say, according to either Medrash, the Tanchuma or the Medrash Rabbah, he doesn't say one word about the fact that you know why the Jews deserve all these horrible things? You know why they're still in Galus? Because they are willing to sacrifice their own to the authorities. They were willing to sell me out. They were willing to put me on the chopping block. Doesn't say that. Lashon hara. That's not ordinary lashon hara. That's extreme lashon hara. How come he doesn't give that the gravitas that it deserves?
Because he doesn't want to actually bring them down even further.
Something that is like similar to that and even worse, like an abuse or something, and they mention it to the authorities.
Right.
You can't call that
Lashon hara. That's what I was saying before, to'eles. So if a person were to report true abuse, for example, to the authorities, that would be for the benefit of the victim. Here, the victim was protected by Moshe. And these guys, rather than being happy that there's a Jewish leader who's actually standing up and protecting innocent lives, they want to spin the story and report him to the authorities, because they want to, I don't know if this is their motivation, but we can speculate that perhaps what they wanted was to be on good terms with the authorities. So let's cozy up to the authorities, even if it means that we speak badly about our own people. I don't think that sounds familiar at all. But, let's try and be in with the in crowd, and then we'll speak badly. It's much worse than just reporting somebody who's doing a crime and trying to get things sorted out. So we've got to understand what's happening here. And in order to understand this, we've got to ask ourselves the key question, which we will open up for us an understanding, appreciation of what lashon hara is and why it is so bad. And that is, where are we in history at the time of this story? What's about to happen? And the easy answer is to say they're about to leave Egypt. But what's about to happen? And by the way, it's not about to happen. Moshe is still going to run away to Midian, and he's going to stay there for a few decades, and he's only going to come back much later. But when he comes back, what's going to happen? What's due to happen? What is he waiting for? What's he anticipating? And hopefully the other Jews at the same time were anticipating too. What are they waiting to see? Yetzias Mitzrayim, right? The Exodus, redemption, the closest experience ever in our history to what we're waiting for right now, which is Moshiach. It's the closest we've ever had. That's what they're waiting for, with one major difference. One significant difference between when Moshiach walks through the door right now. By the way, that's the problem with rabbis. I don't know if you know this. Rabbis are the greatest impediment to Moshiach coming. Because give me another 15 minutes, Moshiach, then you can come. Right now, I'm busy. Rabbis are the only ones who are going to lose their jobs when Moshiach comes. Think about it. Even doctors are not going to lose their jobs when Moshiach. Do you know this? Even doctors will not lose their jobs when Moshiach comes because Jews are so paranoid, we'll go back to the doctors to make sure we're still okay. So here we are, we're waiting for Moshiach. We want Moshiach to walk through the door. Moshiach walks through the door right now. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? Other than the fact that you have to cancel your plans for today and you can have a big fleishik lunch. But what's going to happen when Moshiach walks through the door? The world will change. We're not going to change. The Jewish people are not going to fundamentally change. We are already the Jewish people, the Am Segula. We are already a unique nation that has a unique connection to Hashem. The world around us will change, as the Gemara says, Ein bein ha'olam hazeh limoisa Moshiach. There's no distinction between the current world and the time of Moshiach. Ela shibud malchios bilvad, except that we'll be relieved of persecution by the other nations, which means essentially that the big media houses will close their doors and the UN will fold. But we're not going to change. Our circumstances will change. Now, when the Jews were in Egypt, what was going to change? They were going to change. Yes, their circumstances would change. That's true. But that's not even the big deal. The big deal is they were fundamentally going to change. The Navi Yecheskel tells us that when they left Mitzrayim, that is the birth of the Jewish nation. They were going to become a nation. They were going to become a nation which subsequently Hashem would ratify at the foot of Mount Sinai and call them the Am Segula, the treasured nation, the chosen nation. That was only going to happen when they left Mitzrayim. Prior to that, when they lived in Egypt, what was the designation of the Jewish people? What was the demographic classification of the Jewish people at that point? Avadim is a designation of their status, right? They were slaves. But if you had to refer to the Jewish people, you'd call them what?
Immature.
You call them immature. You call them what? Tinok Shenishba. That's true. That is true. It's absolutely true. They would be called. You don't have to look that far. It's in the Torah. They were called Bnei Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael means the family, the children of a man called Israel, otherwise known as Yaakov. In other words, they were one big family. I don't know if it was a happy family, but it was a big family. That's what they were. There was no concept of nationhood. By the way, it's subject for another conversation. It is fascinating that the Jewish people are the only people to become a nation and then find a land. Whereas other nations first establish a land and based on that create an identity. But that's subject for another conversation. They were going to become a nation, and prior to this they were not a nation.
Excuse my ignorance, but do Goyim have a mitzvah not to talk lashon hara?
Good question. It's a good question. Do the nations of the world have a prohibition against speaking lashon hara? So I don't know if you know this, but there are people who have over the centuries put together various forms of a Shulchan Aruch for the 7 Noach laws. Because there has to be Torah guidance. The Rambam says clearly that in order to fulfill the 7 Noach laws, you have to fulfill it in the context that it's given by Hashem through Moshe at Sinai. So we have a responsibility to the world to create some kind of a Shulchan Aruch, and there have been attempts at this multiple times through the course of history, and there is a debate in that context whether lashon hara is or is not something that applies in the non-Jewish world. It's a very interesting topic. Maybe in one of the future seminars you could look at this in detail because it's fascinating. So what happens to the Jewish people? They become a nation. Now, is that true? You just took my word for it because I'm standing on this side of the stender. So you just took my word for it that I said that they became a nation, and prior to the Exodus they were not a nation. But is that true? Is it true? Not necessarily. Or as we say in the classics, not so pashut. The Rambam in Hilchos Avodah Zarah, which is in Yesodei HaTorah, just after Yesodei HaTorah. So in the laws of idolatry, if anybody's ever read the Rambam's Hilchos Avodah Zarah, he gives a lengthy introduction, an historical introduction to how Avodah Zarah happened in the first place. It's really interesting, not just that it's interesting information. It's really interesting that the Rambam, writing a book of laws, chooses to stick in a whole bunch of history. It feels out of place. Doesn't, for example, tell us the history of how we learned how to shecht, right? So when he discusses that history, the backstory of idolatry, he tells us how originally, obviously, everybody knew about Hashem, obviously, because Adam was created by Hashem, Chava was created by Hashem. They were completely conscious of Hashem. They passed that on to their children. And then he speaks about how people started to corrupt their thinking, and they started to accept the possibility that there is what we call shituf, that Hashem has outsourced, He's delegated. He learned from the best that if you really want to run the world, you have to delegate. And then eventually they reached a point where they figured if you pray to those entities that Hashem had delegated to, you're going to have more mazel in your life, etc. And then the Rambam uses this expression. He says the concept of belief in God almost disappeared completely until the great light Avraham came into this world and he reintroduced monotheistic belief. And he passed it on to his children, and they passed it on to their children. And even when the Jews were in Egypt, the Rambam says, they had the tribe of Levi, who was completely focused on monotheistic belief. And he uses this expression. There was no other ummah that lived with belief in Hashem. What's an ummah? A nation. That implies that we were a nation even before we left Egypt. So what's the big chap that we went from Egypt to become a nation? We are already a nation. An ummah. The Rambam says it. The Rambam doesn't use words loosely. So here is the key to understand what is happening. There are two types of nation on earth. Everybody else and us. What does that mean, everybody else and us? Everybody else became nations because they got a group of people together and they decided we're going to start a nation. And this is how we're going to identify this nation. This is the nation state, and this is going to be our currency or our flag or our language or our set of rules or our culture. And then if you want to be part of our nation, you're going to have to conform. You're going to have to belong to whatever the elements are of our rules. How did we become a nation for real? Hashem chose us. Uvonu v'charta mikol am veloshoin. Hashem chose us from the whole mix of what's out there. He chose us to become His nation. In other words, before we left Egypt, we were a nation like any other nation, in the sense that we were a nation because we chose to have shared values, and we chose to speak a certain language, and we chose to dress a certain way, and we chose to have names that were different from the Egyptian names. It was our choice. When we left Mitzrayim, then Hashem chose us. You know, there's a huge difference between something that is human-made and something that is divinely ordained. Huge difference. Because anything that is human-made will change. Not can change, it will change. It's inevitable. It's going to change. Anything that is divinely ordained can never change. So when we were this nation in Egypt, whatever that meant to be a nation in Egypt, it was of our doing, and it was at risk at any time that the pressure and the persecution of Egypt might destroy us. We might fall apart at the seams. But when Hashem took us out of Egypt, Lo voi lo kachas lo goy mikerev goy, as we read in this last parasha, where Hashem reached into a nation to remove another nation from within that nation. From that moment on, we are in a unique position. It can never disappear. That's why you look at the course of history, and we know the pattern. We know how history works. These other nations come along, they strut their stuff on the stage of the world, and what happens? They then disappear into the stardust of history, and we're still here, either just telling the story or celebrating the end of that particular empire, as the case might be. Our endurance is not because we're special people, not because we are the great innovative nation. Our endurance is because Hashem chose us. Now here's the point about choice. Can we do a little thought experiment over here? Imagine for one moment that you were 20 years younger, okay? So everybody now is 5 years old. And somebody walks into the room right now, in this room, and we're a group of 5-year-olds. Somebody walks right into this room and says, you now have a choice. In the one container, we have chocolate ice cream. In the other container, we have broccoli. What would you like? Needless to say, we are living in the postmodern age. All of the kids would choose broccoli. Vegan broccoli. So now, if the kids line up at the chocolate ice cream, is that a choice they made? Did they have to sit there and choose? Am I going to have the broccoli or am I going to have the ice cream? No, it's no choice. The choice was made for them. In other words, when we speak about choice, we have to recognize what choice means. Choice is never a choice if the options are obvious. Choice is only a choice when there's some level of dilemma or some level of similarity. So in other words, when you go after this, because it's the 9 days, and I don't know, there seems to be this subculture of the 9 days, you have to have milchiks. Because you can't have fleishik, so you have to have a little bit extra chocolate, a little bit extra ice cream. It's the 9 days. Not worried that maybe just now we're going to have meat lunch. So you go from here to Gelatasimo. And now you've got to choose, are you going to have salted caramel? Or are you going to have stracciatella? This is a big dilemma. Have you ever watched Jews at the ice cream bar? It's a whole thing. I don't know. Maybe I should have it. Can I have a little spoon? Just a little spoon to taste. It's like when Jews go to a kosher restaurant. It's such an interesting thing to observe. There should be a whole thesis, a psychological thesis on Jews at kosher restaurants. Sit there. The waiter comes. 2 more minutes, just 2 more minutes. You've been to this restaurant 600 times. There are only 5 restaurants in the whole town. You still don't know the menu. 1 second, just to make sure. The waiter comes back and you say, do me a favor, what do you recommend? What do you think? Like he's some kind of culinary expert. Choice is only relevant where there's some level of dilemma or some level of similarity. If the differences are so stark and obvious, I don't have to make a choice. If it is 3 degrees outside, I don't have to choose not to wear a summer outfit. But when you have to go to a simcha, and now you've got to decide, are you wearing this? Are you wearing that? That's when you invest choice. What that means is, every time that we make a choice, we express who we are. That's why no 2 choices are the same. You cannot expect that because you make choice X, that somebody else should make the same choice. Because choice ultimately is an expression of self, or as the expression goes, al ta'am v'reach ein lisvakeach. When it comes to fragrance, when it comes to taste, you can't debate it. You can't say, I can't believe you don't like mushrooms. That's how it is. It's personal. When we execute a choice, we're expressing who we are. When Hashem executes the choice to make the Jewish nation his people, it's not just that the Jews are the most outstanding people on earth, and they have therefore proven their worth, and that's why I'm choosing them. That wouldn't be a choice. That would not require choice. That would be objective, because we have some value to bring to the table, therefore it's logical that we should be the nation. Choice means that Hashem looks at all the nations on earth and perceives them in a way that we will never understand because Hashem is infinite, and he sees value in every nation on earth. And yet he chooses us. That means if you have made a choice, it's not fair for anybody to question your choice. Why did you choose it? Because that's what I like. Yeah, but why do you like it? Because that's what I like. It doesn't require a level of logic to defend it. It's my choice. This is me. This is why I am me and I'm not you. Because this is my choice. So we could say, Hashem, how could you choose the Jewish people? They're serving idols. That's what the angel said at Kriyas Yamsuf. They said, Halalu oivdei avodah zara. They're serving idols. Halalu oivdei avodah zara. They're serving idols. How could you choose them over them? And the answer is because that's what choice is. Choice is what I want, not what they have proven to me. Therefore, even if the Jews have served avodah zara, Hashem can say, I choose them anyway. I love them anyway. Af al pi shechata Yisraelhu. Even if the person is a sinner, they're Jewish, and that's never going to disappear. Why? Because I am choosing that. Not because they have value that the rest of the world doesn't have, because I've invested myself in them, and nobody can challenge that. But there has to be a them. If there is no them, who is Hashem choosing? If they are willing to speak negatively about each other, then they're not a them. If Hashem is looking to choose a nation, but the people in that nation are willing to speak behind each other's backs, then they're not a nation. Then they're not a being, they're not an entity, they're not on the menu of choice. That's what Moshe sees. He says, here we're at this crossroads in history. We're at the most incredible potential moment of history where Hashem is going to take us and turn us into a nation. But we have to be that entity for Hashem to choose. If we're all skinnering, if we're all sharing negative about each other, we're not those people. I understand why we're not yet redeemed, because I see the breakdown within our community. Then the Medrash Rabbah adds to that, or in Rashi's commentary, Rashi then expands by quoting the Medrash Rabbah later in his commentary. Not only does that explain why it is that the Jews could not leave Mitzrayim at that point, because to leave Mitzrayim you have to be the nation Hashem is going to choose. And right now that nation is not a nation. Right now that nation is a whole broken, fractured society. But Moshe says, I even understand now why they have to suffer, why they're in the slavery. Because what's the only reason in the world that a person would speak lashon hara? What's the only reason in the world that a person would see negative in somebody else? The only reason is because they take themselves too seriously.
It's the ego.
Correct. It's the ego. You know what they say? The human being is able to take one finger, put that finger in front of their eyes, and if you look at that finger, you cannot see the rest of the world. A number of years ago, quite a number of years ago, a Russian refusnik, who was a very, very qualified professor, he went on to be the head of the hydrodynamics department at Beersheba University. His name was Professor Herman Branover. He went to visit the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the Rebbe said to him, what's the difference between the sun and a black hole? He said the difference, the Rebbe told him, is that they both have the same amount of energy. It's just a question of the direction that energy flows. The sun radiates its power outwards to illuminate and warm others. The black hole sucks its energy in and only thinks about itself. And that's one of the most profound lessons in interpersonal relations. The only reason a person could speak negatively about somebody else is if we think negatively about somebody else. And the only reason we could think negatively about somebody else is if we take ourselves too seriously. You have a Dasan and Aviram who are so self-absorbed in their reality, their perception, their need to rub shoulders with the Pharaoh, that they are willing to risk the life of a fellow Jew. You cannot be chosen as a nation if everybody's a black hole. So what happens is not that they are punished with slavery, but the experience of slavery breaks that ego. It breaks that sense of self. It creates a tremendous equalizer between people. Because it doesn't matter how smart you are, doesn't matter how rich you are, doesn't matter how much yichus you have. At the end of the day, everybody was schlepping the same bricks and the same stones and being whipped with the same whips. You hear that about survivors of the Holocaust, speaking about how one of the things that they missed about the concentration camps was the fact that nobody was better than anybody else. Everybody looked the same, everybody was treated the same. There were no Ashkenazim and Sfardim in a concentration camp. There were no Hasidim and Misnagdim. There was no frum and not frum. They were just Jews. That's why Moshe says, I understand now why Hashem has put us through this torture, because it will break us so we stop hanging onto our own egos to the extent that we speak negatively about each other. Because when we speak negatively, lashon hara is that bad that it doesn't allow us to be that chosen people. Could you think of a lesson that is more relevant in 2024? Yeah. On the 6th of October, 2023, the Jewish world was so, unfortunately, fractured. Everybody was speaking lashon hara about everybody else, whether it was in Eretz Yisrael specifically, with the judicial reform, whether it was around the world, with everybody being so partisan, and you're that kind of Jew, and I'm this kind of Jew, and that's no good. And we don't know, Eini Tonu Yodea Adma, we don't understand how Hashem works, we can only reflect on our experiences. But there's no question that in the last 10 months, we have been delivered a scathing blow, a devastating blow that brought us all back down to a common denominator. That even now, when people are still trying here and there, protest and another protest, it's got a fundamentally different flavor to it. That while you have people who are upset with the government or upset with each other, there is this unifying aspect that we cannot escape, that has been part and parcel of the collective Jewish consciousness for the last 10 months. It is an undoing of Daltoria. It is an undoing of lashon hara that is unprecedented. Certainly in modern history and probably in all of Jewish history since the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And so we have to, as we go into Tisha B'Av, we have to daven to Hashem. That the reason we had a Tisha B'Av in the first place was because of Daltoria, because we didn't treat each other well, because we were happy to speak against each other, because there were Jews who were collaborating with the Romans, because there were Jews who were selling each other out. And the only way we reverse that is by reversing the cause, which is by coming together in a way of absolute oneness and unity. Am Echad. We want to be Hashem's Am, Hashem's nation. It's Am Echad. And I really feel we have the right to speak to Hashem as we go into Tisha B'Av and say, we've done it. We've done it for the last 10 months. We have broken down barriers that nobody believed could ever fall. We have a sense of unity and shared purpose and care and concern for each other, which is unprecedented and hasn't disappeared after 10 months. It wasn't a flash in a pan because we were all so traumatized for the first few weeks. It's still there. It's sustained. And so therefore, we should daven that this year on Tisha B'Av, at the exact moment that our enemies are dafka choosing to try to attack us, using psychological warfare, publicizing that they're choosing this time because it is a bad time for the Jews, We should daven that it should be like Haman, who also chose and publicized when he thought he would attack the Jewish people because he believed it would be a bad time for us. But we know that Tisha B'Av is a moyed. We know that Tisha B'Av is Nachem. We know that Tisha B'Av is the birth of Mashiach. We've been davening and hoping for this for so many years. Hashem should grant us, in the merit of the unique achdus and unity of the Jewish people that we've lived with for the last 10 months, that this in fact should be the year that we celebrate in Yerushalayim instead of mourning on Tisha B'Av.